Okay. So, welcome back. How are you? It's okay?
Everything okay? Tutto posto.
You had a fair lunch?
We did.
So, my dear friends, what we have to do this afternoon is to continue presenting the slides while waiting for the Diageo case study, which is a case study on what we have seen so far, basically. Okay? But we need to finish at least, this set of slides plus the second one. The second one is much more, it's 12, 13 slides, that's not a lot. The big one is this one. Okay? I hope you remember that before. First of all, let me welcome the other colleagues that have joined us in the afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. What I was saying is that.
Avevo detto che arrivavo
Very
da
good. Conosci i tuoi polli. Okay. My dear friends, I hope you remember, if you are talking especially to those who have joined us only this afternoon. Sorry, let me also, because otherwise you don't see, right? Yes. We have basically introduced as something new vis-a-vis what we saw yesterday, the agency costs, okay? And I've told you what they are, what kind of temptations they may somehow instill into the management slash shareholders of a firm, and what are the possible action or remedies that creditors may adopt in order to reduce at least the possibility of this misbehavior from managers and shareholders. Okay. What I want to tell you is that we are now somehow ready to put on a balance, the major pros and the major cons of debt financing, in order to highlight if and where a company may have an optimal or ideal capital structure, mix of debt and equity. The major pros of debt financing, as I repeatedly told you yesterday and also this morning, I would say, is the tax advantage of debt, which plays a rather important role, especially for companies which are highly profitable. Okay, because they can have an incentive, a strong incentive to borrow money in order to reduce the amount of the tax bill. That's the major plus that we put on one of the plates of the balance. But we also have on the other side some drawbacks, some disadvantages, some cons of debt financing, which are basically the costs of financial distress. That in turn are made up of bankruptcy costs and agency costs. Okay? pay attention to what I'm saying you now, because it's important also for the analysis of the RGO case and also for your short-term purposes. If we, according to the trade-off model, trade-off model, a company should leverage itself up to the point where the pros and cons of that financing balance each other. This is what the trade-off model says. Okay, it's called trade-off model. And this model is probably let's leave aside the word probably, because it's a certainty more than a probability. This model says it's the most popular in practice, okay, among practitioners. And what do I mean with the practitioners to this specific field of research? I mean commercial banks, the department normally named corporate banking. I mean strategic advisory companies like Value Partners, like Bain, like PwC, KPMG, EY, Deloitte, and so on. But I also mean the investment banks when they apply, when they want to understand what the appropriate debt equity ratio of a firm should be. The answer to this request is called the trade-off model, which is a model that you will apply also to the Diageo case, in the Diageo case. Okay? Now, the fact that we must, well, let me put it this way. Well, actually, I have a slide on that. I already presented yesterday to you, because that slide shows everything. Is it? Here. Either this one or this one. You remember this slide that we saw yesterday? Okay. If you remember this slide, I told you that practitioners, not Modigliani Miller. Modigliani Miller are the top candidates. But practitioners believe that the cost of capital of the firm, which means this curve, okay, the cost of capital of the firm is U-shaped, exactly like the one that you see here. It's a curve that is similar to U, okay? And according to this curve, if it is U-shaped, I don't remember exactly what was the theorem in the calculus that said that if the function is U-shaped, like this one, there is a minimum point somewhere. Weierstrass, probably. Oh, anyway, it's 30 years ago. It's really difficult that I can remember the name of the guy that, according to the theorem of supposed Weierstrass, if you have a U-shaped curve, there is a minimum somewhere. Very sophisticated point. And the minimum is more or less on this graph where you see the dotted vertical line there. But the most important consequence of the fact that it is U-shaped curve, according to practitioners, is the fact that companies, there is something that we can call an optimal debt equity ratio. Optimal, target, ideal, call it as you prefer, optimal capital ratio. And according to the trade-off model, this optimal capital ratio, capital structure ratio, is where the cost of capital of the firm reaches a minimum point, the minimum point. The ideal capital structure is the one that corresponds to the minimum weighted average cost of capital of the firm. Also, if you prefer, that corresponds to the there's another term, to the minimum cost of capital. Why is this the optimal? Why can we consider this as an optimal capital structure? Because it minimizes the cost of capital. And following the suggestion, the question of your friend that she asked this morning, what's your name?
Adela.
Gabriela.
Adela.
Adela. Where do you come from?
From China.
You weren't sure about where you're coming from.
I am, but like nationality is a little bit different, so it's hard to explain.
Okay. Don't worry, I don't want to enter into this long discourse. Adela said, you remember what she said? The fact that we have a line, is a line just per se, or it's a division? It's a division, okay, and the denominator of that fraction is the cost of capital, right? So, as I repeatedly told, and I'm repeating it for the nth time, given a certain numerator of that formula, of that fraction, the more you minimize the denominator, the more you maximize the result, which is the enterprise value. Okay? So that's why the minimum cost of capital could be, actually is the objective of the financial manager, because by minimizing the cost of capital, all other things are equal, you can maximize the value of the firm and thus the happiness of shareholders and creditors. That's very simple but powerful. Okay. The thing is that I would like, let me see if I can do it here at least once in our meeting. So I'm trying to use this one, because this is something that you need to familiarize with a lot. Rather than seeing the picture, I want to see what brings you to the picture. Now, what? It should be this one. See? It should be this one. Okay, now I want to explain you. Non è il caso di muoverlo? No, non mi frega niente, vedo lo so. Sono contento. Scrivo. Pay attention to what I'm showing you now. Suppose that we put on a graph. Sì. Facciamo le cose cum grano salis. Supponiamo di mettere sull'asse delle ordinate e sull'asse delle ascisse, ma che cosa è? Marco?
Professor, it's not sharing in the.
A chi se ne frega?
No, the students in home cannot see.
Esatto.
Okay.
I'm kidding, quasi tutti permalosi, no? E quindi per condividere come devo fare?
Professore, mi scusi, non vediamo più la visualizzazione della web.
Lo so, ma vedete un foglio bianco?
No, vediamo solo il suo nome scritto Antonio Salvi, organizzatore.
Ah, ok. Chiami Nicolò. Ma è strano, aspetta. E se faccio così, che cosa? Credo che torniamo a questa schermata. Esatto.
Però adesso ora va. Loro vedono, ma noi non vediamo.
Passa a vista in primo piano. Tieni. No. Troppo bello per essere vero, ho casinato tutto, ragazzi.
Quando c'è scritto layout dovrete.
Ma adesso non lo vedete neanche così. Allora rimuovi.
Scusate, ma faccio. Rimuovi dal mio piano, ok, per Bruxelles peggio ancora. Non facciamo. Se facessimo una cosa. Let me try something.
Ok.
Adesso passiamo.
Adesso vediamo.
Cosa?
Vediamo lì.
Non è con un granché, dovreste vedere un foglio bianco.
No.
No.
No, allora non vedo.
No, però ragazzi, mannaggia, ho perso un sacco di tempo su sta roba. Volevo condividere anche con i ragazzi a casa questo. Esatto, sì, lo so, eravamo prima. Benissimo. Ah, interrompi il video, devo interrompere.
No, in teoria non dovrebbe essere così. Non so perché.
Adesso però non è più interrompo.
小小
No,
的
adesso lo rimetto.
Cioè interrompo un attimo e rimetto?
Sì, non so perché.
Cioè lo interrompo ma poi
Lo rimette
e fa. Scusa, Felice, a casa vedete cosa vedete?
Tutto bianco ora.
Bravo.
Ok, adesso vedete una mano?
Sì?
E adesso se dovessi tornare invece alle slide, torno dunque, su interrompi video metto l'altro intenderci. Vado qua.
Sì, faccio anche video, cambio da quello. La mia video.
Non sapevo. Vabbè, a posto, grazie.
Prego.
Okay, guys, so if we put on the horizontal axis, you can see yes. If we put on the horizontal axis the debt equity ratio, okay, and we put RE, RD, RA, or if you prefer, the weighted average cost of capital. Okay, the story goes as follows. In order to show you what are the effects of tax shield on debt and bankruptcy costs. The RD, well, let me put it this way. The formula WACC is RD times 1 minus T times D over D plus E plus RE multiplied by E over D plus E. Okay? And let me highlight this part here. So what happens is that with the starting point is RD. We start with RD. RD is the cost of debt, okay? And it reflects the interest rate that the company pays to the banks. For low level of debt equity ratio, the cost of debt remains rather flat. It increases but mildly. Okay. Then when the debt equity ratio exceeds a certain threshold or starts becoming excessive, it increases more rapidly. Okay? This is RD. Okay? But the good news, I don't have another color here, but suppose that I'm now using the red color. Okay? This is RD, but actually that's the gross cost of debt. But actually we know that by borrowing money we have an advantage. Now we're dealing with advantage. And this advantage is represented by the tax shield of debt. In other words, by this parenthesis. So that the real cost of debt of the firm is going to be this one, slightly lower, well, slightly, depends on the tax rate, but in any case it's going to be lower. And it's given by RD multiplied by 1 minus T. By definition it's lower because we are multiplying by 1 minus T. Okay, so this is the actual RD. Here we already have everything in this curve here. We have the major advantage of that financing represented by this downward shift of RD that will pull presumably down the weighted average cost of capital. But we also have the major negative effects of that financing, which are bankruptcy costs and agency costs, theoretically, but also practically, if we could draw a line here, this difference here, the fact that the cost of debt becomes higher when the company is perceived being excessively leveraged, can be explained by the costs of financial business. So this is the tax advantage. This difference is the tax advantage. Salud. And these are the costs of financial distress. Okay? The plus, this is a plus. These are minuses. Okay? Plus in terms of advantage, minus in terms of disadvantage. Everything is already here, it's behind RD. What happens according to practitioners? What happens according to practitioners to RE? Well, RE will follow RD. Let me see if it works with this one. So, well, actually, RD is this one. Okay. RE follows RE. Why? Because we have seen with proposition 2 of Modigliani Miller that RE, I was saying correctly, is a function of the debt equity ratio. The higher the debt equity ratio, proposition 2, the higher the RE. Remember that? Che è successo? Vi eccita il grafico? È pericoloso sta cosa, ragazzi. RE so is something like this. Always. It follows it's something similar to RD to a higher level. Okay? This is R times 1 minus D. Final step, what happens to the weighted average cost of capital? In other words, to this element here of our analysis. We have depicted RD first, then RE second. We need to now depict RA, or if you prefer, weighted average cost of capital. Okay? What happens according to your prestigious opinion? What's going to happen with the weighted average cost of capital? Which is a weighted average of this is the formula. We have seen this. We have seen this. We have seen this. Now we need to build this by changing progressively, because we move from the left to the right, the amount of D. Thank you very much for your contribution. I appreciate it. So, well, let me bring you hand by hand, romantically, toward the magical world of the weighted average cost of capital. What happens? What happens to the cost of capital when the debt equity ratio is 0? Where do you position the WACC? But in one point, just one point, where D is equal to 0, in other words, on the vertical axis.
RE.
Bravo! Come ti chiami tu?
Non ci so pensare. Hai risposto
Scusa, nel senso chiaro, vedo una massa indistinta di persone. Tan, la mia adorata Tan, esatto. Tan says, when the debt equity ratio is equal to 0, the weighted average cost of capital is here. Why? Because this component is equal to 0, this one is equal to 100%, so everything is, the weighted average cost of capital is equal to 100. Bravissima, molto bene. What happens the more we move from this point on toward the right side of the graph? And it means that we increase the debt equity ratio. What happens? It happens that we will be substituting progressively the most expensive, because it's a higher level, the most expensive source of financing with a cheaper one. Okay, so we will be, the more we move from the left to the right, here is zero, that equity ratio is 0%. Here it could be, I don't know, 10%. Here it could be 50%. Here it could be 100%. Okay? But the more we move from the left to the right of this graph, the more we are increasing this component that is cheaper than the other one. If in a mix of sources of financing you progressively increase the cheaper one, the weighted average goes down. It's arithmetical, huh? It's not an extraordinary intuition of Antonio Salvi. It's something that goes to the primary school, okay? Which means that it goes something like this, right? And it goes progressively down the more you add debt in the capital structure, because the more you are including an ingredient that is cheaper than the other. But then the bad news is that RD starts increasing exponentially. So it is true that toward a very high level of debt equity ratios, the weighted average cost of capital will be asymptotic to RD, but RD is going to increase, so presumably the average is going to do something like this. Here is 100% debt, more or less, whatever. So the weighted average cost of capital de facto becomes equal to RD, while here it's 0%, so it becomes equal to RE. In the middle, there is this U-shaped. You see the U, why it is a U-shaped curve? That's what I wanted to show you. Because that's exactly the way it should go, according to practitioners. Okay? Something like this. And if this is the case, this is a U-shaped curve that it has somewhere, I don't know, more or less here, its minimum point. The minimum point that corresponds, in turn, to an optimal debt equity ratio that we could call DE star. Okay? That's the explanation of the graph. How do we get that graph? Okay? Now, the thing that I want to tell you is that, okay, this is the practitioner view, Mr. Sartre, great. But what's the major difference between this view and the Modigliani-Miller view? Modigliani-Miller would argue that this line here, RE, according to practitioners grows this way, is a concave, no actually it's convex function. It should be exactly the opposite. According to Modigliani and Miller, this is something that should go this way. Okay, this is RE according to Modigliani and Miller. And if this is the way it goes with the Modigliani-Miller, this red line here, there's a red curve here, arithmetically, this can be proved, it's going to be horizontal line in the Modigliani-Miller work. So there are these two conflicting viewpoints, okay? These two conflicting viewpoints that I wanted to show you. This view of the world, the practitioner's view of the world, gives birth to what is called the trade-off model. Antonio, see? Why is it called trade-off? Because there is a trade-off. Between what? Between tax advantages and financial distress costs, which are in turn bankruptcy costs and agency costs. And you need to find the balance, and the balance is here. You need to find the balance, and the balance is here. You see it? You can see it. It's here between the pros and the cons. The major pros is tax advantage. The major drawback is the other one. It means the financial distress costs. Okay? What are the practical consequences of the trade-off model suggested by practitioners. Let me wear the glasses again. The practical consequences are of various types. The most important one, but now I'm commenting the graph together with you like in a coffee bar while drinking a coffee, okay? The first thing that I would be tempted to say is that consequences. The first one, which is something that I have repeatedly mentioned, but you never know. There is an ideal debt equity ratio, and you will see that this debt equity, let's call it star, or highlight this level of debt equity ratio, is going to be rather important when later on we're going to present the pecking order theory, which is an alternative theory to the trade-off model that helps explaining the financial choices of firms, that reaches the conclusion that there is no such thing as an optimal debt equity ratio. So we need to highlight this, to emphasize this point, because it's a radical difference between another model that I will be presenting later on. Okay. So an ideal debt equity ratio, it exists. Okay. Second, this debt equity ratio, debt equity star, can be computed, can be estimated, more than computed. And that's another important thing, because I know there are some techniques that help me estimating RD, estimating RE, computing the weighted average cost of assets. I can compare this graph, which seems to be a pure theoretical graph. It can be applied in practice. And that's a major difference, because it means that you can advise company on where to position themselves. Okay? Third point. We should not observe companies with debt equity ratio equal to 0. That's another consequence, right? Debt equity ratio equal to 0 means companies positioning themselves here, right? But this is clearly, according to the trade-off model, clearly irrational, because this cost here is higher than this cost here, so you are not maximizing the value of the firm. This raises a major conundrum, by the way, because you could say, if that's the conclusion, that's one of the conclusions that the trade-off model reaches, how the hell can we justify the existence of very important companies out there which live and thrive with 0 debt? Some companies deliberately do not borrow money. And this deliberate action would be completely inconsistent with the prescriptions of the trade-off model, because it means that these companies deliberately position themselves here, but this point here is higher than this one here that they could ideally reach, that minimizes the cost of capital and thus maximizes the value of the firm. So this is a question mark, an open question. How is it possible that? We'll see later on, probably immediately after, or in a couple, 20 minutes, we will see that there is an alternative model, which is called pecking order model, that can be used to justify why some companies act this way rather than following the prescriptions of the trade-off model. Fourth, and I would say final, it comes from the third one. Suppose let's put it this way. Suppose that you are here, which is clearly an irrational behavior, according to this model. Okay? You realize that you are behaving irrationally, okay? And you want to change the situation. You want to move from here to here. Another advantage of the trade-off model is that it shows you the path that you need to follow in order to reach the minimum point. So you know how much debt you need to have in order to move from where you are to where you would like to be. Okay? And needless to say, it also implicitly and or indirectly tells you which are the possible speeds at which you can reach the this optimal level. So this is the optimal level. Okay? And we will see in the second set of slides, that there are some techniques, tools, methodologies, call them as you prefer, in order to reach this optimal level. Okay? These I would say, so for it tells companies the path to the optimal. Okay? This model, the trade-off model, is very, very important. Because behind this model there is a lot of advisory firms, consulting firms, commercial banks, investment banks, and so on and so forth that ground at least a part of their activity exactly on the application of this model. What I'm telling you is that many banks, many advisory firms, they do have the internal, very sophisticated Excel models and graphs in order to create this graph, in other words, and to tell their clients, you are here, like in a supermarket, right? At the entrance of the supermarket, you have this big board saying, you are here, right? And then you say, oh, but I want to reach, Zara, and Zara is there, that's my optimum. So you know how far it is, and you can also highlight which are the possible alternative paths that you can reach in order to reach the optimum. Okay? Needless to say, now I'm offending you, so please forgive me for what I'm saying. If a company is here, it's over-leveraged. It's excessively leveraged. In order to optimize its situation, should decrease the amount of debt, should move from the right to the left in order to reach the minimum point. Okay, so you can be in a sub-optimal situation, both from the left or from the right of the minimum point, right? In the left, if you are on the left of the optimal point, you are under-leveraged. If you are on the right of the optimal point, you are over-leveraged. You are excessively leveraged. Okay? Questions? Curiosities? Anecdotes? Requests for additional clarifications? Prego. Togli la maschera su questo.
A lot of times there are a lot of, for example, private equity companies that are over-leveraged, but they work like just fine.
Absolutely, yeah. This model says that you simply know that you are not operating at the optimal level. Then it's up to you to say, I know it, but I want to stay there. Absolutely. But having said that, let me say that this is a model that is not applied to private equity investors. We are de facto implicitly applying it to non-financial companies. Non-financial companies. Because financial companies, they have, as you know, some peculiarities that for which you cannot apply it. But in any case, it's a good suggestion what you were saying, that because it helps me specifying that some companies, as I told you, they know that they are under leveraged. They know that they have zero debt, but they want to stay there. Other companies, they know that they have an excessive leverage, but they may prefer staying there. Others may say, if I'm here or over here, I would like to go toward the optimal point. It's their choice. Okay? There's an example that,
But which is let's say the signal that they send to the market, for example. If a company chooses to be in a high leverage point, probably they are saying to the investors, let's say they are sending a signal in a negative way. I mean, so
absolutely. That's a very good point. Thank you. What is your name?
Alex.
Last one? Gioca. Ah già, scusa, ma c'è ragazzi, l'Alzheimer sul galoppo. Scusa Alex. C'è, il tedesco c'è?
Probably the train was late.
The train from where? From Munich? Where does he live? Siamo fatti su, no? Ah, the train was a generic state. Okay, I thought that
The Italian train was late.
well, today we came with the Italo from Milan. It was perfectly on time. Embarrassing. Come on, 1 minute of delay. Let me feel at home. Perfectly on time. Amazing.
Italo.
È sempre abbastanza puntuale. Sì, sì, devo riconoscere. Ah, infatti io prendo solo Italo. Anche per risparmio. Risparmio, arrivo on time e ci vuoi i treni sono di qualità decente, oggettivamente. Scusa. So, following the leveraging on Alex's suggestion, the fact that the trade-off model is absolutely a popular model and is commonly accepted in practice, it is also a reflection of what happens on the market when the company is operating suboptimally. In fact, we can observe that if a company is over-leveraged, it's here, and it announces a recapitalization means that they want to move toward here, the market reaction is always positive. Conversely, it's more debated if a company which is here moves here, if the stock market reaction is positive or not. In other words, we have a certainty from here to here. There are some doubts from here to here. Why? And this helps us also introducing the example that I wanted to share with you. Because you need to convince the market that leveraging more, in other words, moving from here toward here, is good for your company because you are exploiting the tax advantage of debt without incurring many correlated costs. The example is the following. Into around 1999, 2000, and this one I should find, but I read on Fortune. Fortune is a magazine, you probably have heard about it. I read an interview to the, at that time, CFO of Microsoft. 2000 means 20 years ago. Very brilliant guy, needless to say, but the interviewer was brilliant as well. Because in that case, it was clear that she knew the company, the financial statements, of the company. Because at a certain point, she asked what follows. She said, "Dear Mr. XYZ," I don't remember the name frankly, the CFO of Microsoft, and Bill Gates was still on the CEO. Now you know that he has stepped aside. He said, how can you explain the fact that you have a roughly $60 billion cash in your statements and zero debt? So At that time, if you looked at the balance sheet of Microsoft, assets, liabilities, they had. Let's use it, right? Microsoft. Assets, liabilities, cash. I think it was 56. Let's say $60 billion. Let me repeat: $60 billion. Debt, financial debt, $0. Wow! You are not here. You are here. You have zero debt and a lot of cash. You're in terms of net debt, you have a negative number. If you do total debt minus cash, you have a negative number. And the interviewer correctly asked, she didn't ask the way I'm telling you now, but the idea was the following. Don't you know about the trade-off model and its prescriptions? It means, don't you know that you are here and you are operating suboptimally? She didn't say the trade-off model. How can you justify the fact that you have such a huge amount of cash on hand without doing anything? Okay. Microsoft was incorporated in 1984. Till 2002, it means for the first 20 years, more or less, 18 years, it had never distributed dividends. If you grow and you earn a lot of money and you don't distribute dividends, the cash in your company increases, right? Exactly the amount at that time of $60 billion that they had accumulated over the years. Now she said, why don't you do something with that $60 billion? Okay? And the answer was amazing. I still remember it, even if you have to trust me, but yeah, more or less it was because it was a one sentence answer. He said, the interviewer was a she, he said, because Mr. Gates would like to make some shopping. $60 billion. What? You can buy entire countries, literally with $60 billion, especially 22 years ago. You are the owner of the Da Vinci Code, not the book. I mean, not the book of Dan Brown, the real Da Vinci Code. There are two Da Vinci Codes. One is in Milan, and the other one is in the apartment of Mr. Bill Gates, the Codice Atlantic. It's in. You own whatever you want, right? You don't even know what to do with the money you have. What kind of shopping are you talking about? Behind that sentence, it was 2000. Huh? Behind that sentence, everybody knew that he wanted to exploit, whenever possible, the opportunity of being ready to take over Apple. That was his shopping. Because Steve Jobs was already, you know that he had a couple of, was the first time that he wasn't that good. So, like the real vulture, what do you do? Say, oh wow, he's passing away. That's the right time to take over the firm. Let's get ready, 22 years ago, to take over the firm. So what, and that's the end of the story. It's a cynical, it's a sad story. Well, sad story. Steve Jobs survived for many years, so he didn't, and Apple is still there, and Microsoft is elsewhere. But the idea was that one. Making some shopping wasn't go to the Carrefour, but was to take over Carrefour, the entire company. Would have been easier. But that was the idea. Why am I saying you that? Because going back to what Alex was suggesting before, some companies prefer to stay here because they believe that even if they pay a price in terms of abandoning the idea of reducing the tax bill thanks to the tax shield of debt that you are not exploiting deliberately. They said, for us it's more valuable to keep this amount of cash there, although we know we are paying a higher level of taxes that we could save, okay, in order to be ready to catch good opportunities that may arise on the market. So that's why I told you that, going back to your suggestion of signals, Alex, which is very useful and intelligent, it is not clear, while it is clear moving from here to here that you're doing something good and the market reacts positively, it is not necessarily, there is no consensus, let's put it this way, on this side of the branch, because it depends on what you want to do, why you are keeping your debt equity ratio to such a low level, and if it can be justified, your decision. Alex.
Another question, let's say. Well, let's suppose that our company is in the right side of the optimal point. Based on what you already said right now, if to move from the right point to the optimal point is a good strategy, because
it's a $1 million question. Depends on the specific circumstances.
it is used
Some
by the companies today. I mean, so based on
moving from here to here.
yeah.
Depends. I cannot generalize. I would like to, but I cannot. Okay? So you see how many things you can say on this very simple graph. At the end of the day, it's a very simple graph. Okay? If we go back, if we are able to go back to the slides, I try, Oh. Due.
Prima no.
E 3. No, oggi sono in tranza agonistica, aspetta. E 3.
No, prof, dal bianco.
Ah, giusto. Non volevo dire con sufficienza.
Mi permetterei mai.
Eccolo qua. Pensate che lo vedano anche da casa? Ah, ci abbiamo fatto.
Sì?
Grazie Felice. I love this moment, so I would like to spend. I could say something even more in detail, but we have a limited number of hours, so we cannot go that much into details. But we can follow the suggestion of Alex in order to see something. Probably the last word on. Let me see if there's something I'm missing. Okay, yeah. The last word on the trade-off model, let's call the practitioner's view. There is good evidence that that shows, or according to which, it seems that this optimal. No, but you don't see that anymore. But the optimal point on the graph is reached when companies have a rating. You know what a rating is? Francesca. You know or not? You don't know. Don't look. Elsewhere. Francesca. No, non lo sai, un po' di quello. Aspetta, fammi finire tutto. If they have a rating which is triple B. Triple B. You see the triple B mentioned here? It seems that there is quite robust evidence showing that companies which are at their optimal level, the one that I cannot show you any longer, are those which have a rating that is around triple B. Now, if you allow me to digress for a few minutes, and you can do whatever you want, you can sit back and relax, you can sleep. Important thing is that you don't create negative externalities. You don't snore, you don't shout, you don't make any noise. But I want to spend 5 minutes with Francesca in the rating of firms. It's rhetorical what I'm saying, because I know that most of you don't even know what this word is about. So Francesco, trust me. They don't know. So it's okay. What is rating? And what is this triple B that is written here? A rating is an opinion. Yeah. An opinion, bravo. Allora lo sapete. Solo tu francese non lo sai. Chiedi venia o chiedi venia? Okay, you have it. So, okay, sure. It's a long story, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 2 hours. So, in any case, Francesca, it's an opinion about the probability of default of an issuer of a company. Okay, and there is a range, c'è una scala of possible ratings that you may get. It goes from, if you use the Standard & Poor's rating notation, it goes from AAA to D. AAA is the best rating, D is dead, defaulted. Then there is C, comma, then B, and single A. Triple B is a sort of an average. It's the average rating. Nobody will ever tell you that because it's not written anywhere, but it's de facto the average rating of companies on this planet. And it seems, and that's good news, because if there is enough evidence showing that companies on average, triple B companies, these companies, triple B companies position themselves at the minimum point of our U-shaped curve of the weighted average cost of capital, it also indirectly, implicitly implies that they are behaving on average rationally. Okay, that's it. And if you want me to elaborate on the rating, I would speak for 24 hours, since it is my area of research, but it's a boring area, so you're already enough bored by these things. I mean, I don't want to further worsen the situation. But the rating guy is back here. No, don't start the question with but. Brutto, it's not fair. But, come dire, una cazzata, ma
Is
quindi...
it the same for countries or is it just for
Companies.
companies?
Countries, they don't have a tax advantage. Companies have a tax advantage. Other questions? If you have any curiosity on rating, and I may be somehow helpful, I'm here to help you in case you haven't understood something on rating, but you didn't have the courage to ask a serious professor. You may ask it to me, which I interpret, I wouldn't say as an offense, but you don't care about rating, that's right. But by the way, can I ask you something? You are attending a Master of Science program, right?
Yes.
La laurea magistrale. Okay. Ma la laurea magistrale che si denomina come? Business administration. Okay. I should know, I know that. But I'm a newcomer in Turin. I'm lost. This is the most complex organization I've ever seen on the planet. Corsi che si sposano, chi si divorzia, chi lo fa alla Sama, non lo fai di là, ma no, ma sa. This is the laurea magistrale in business administration. Okay. What kind of courses, financial courses, you have taken so far? Let's take a pause.
This is the second one we have done.
Oh, and the first one was?
International gap
this one.
and analysis.
Yes. And you consider this as a corporate French course? Well, I don't know. Okay. And when did you learn?
The second course of our
Proprio secondo absolutely speaking. Okay. I don't know, it makes more sense. Okay. And who taught you about the rating? How did you know about this important?
Finance.
Okay.
Financial markets.
Bravo. Okay. Who is the instructor?
Georgine.
Bravo. Lui è il mio amico.
in corso Unione intermediari finanziari.
Sempre con Desurino.
No, De Vincentis.
bravo, ma adesso lì. Non mi toccate adesso lì, ragazzi. I love it. Period. Even if presents the yellow pages, the telephone numbers, I will stay there hours listening. I love it. I love it. Can I say that? Siamo a un altro pauso. Che ore? Let's have a 15 minutes break. 15 minutes break, guys.
Bravissimo. A me, cioè, a me era piaciuta tanto. A me era piaciuta tanto.
Bravo. Vai, basta che lo conosci. Personale. Andiamo alla ricerca del personale.
Ma voi quindi avete fatto la magistrale in Corsignone?
Sì, no, la triennale.
Sì, scusa.
Sì.
Ma ho conosciuto un ragazzo che si chiama Stefano Fagione.
Cosa ho fatto? Io ho fatto economia e commercio.
Ah, no.
Vabbè, io ho fatto aziendale, ma nel nostro corso eravamo più di 500, quindi non è che conosciamo proprio tutti. Ma, cioè, magari di vista l'ho visto, però non so.
Sì.
Tu hai fatto qua, la sa?
Sì.
Ti hai trovato bene?
Sì.
Hai fatto qua in italiano o in inglese?
No, in inglese.
Ma in inglese.
Guarda che anche loro dicono che non è stato proprio.
No, ma la nostra era proprio uguale alla vostra, perché
Sì.
confrontavamo.
No, sì, era praticamente uguale, però sì. 算了，宝贝儿，今天你没喝成你的 espresso。
啊，我今天都喝3了。
你刚刚在说什么？
我问海底不知道。海底是咱们同学吗？
没理，他问我，接下来什么时候有课？然后我怎么打算说课表？
应该3万多钱。
你会吗？你要我们最大的。
对。
看来。Sì, ma infatti tu me lo devi inviare. Vabbè, già ah sì, però non l'avevo ancora preso sul telefono, sì, me l'hai inviato, vero?
Così più bello. La foto.
Più chiaro.
Eh no, perché non sono riuscita a fare sul computer, quindi stavo sì,
Vado in
Ah,
mezzo lei,
esatto.
però comunque ho fatto la foto.
Sì, sì, sì.
Ah, sei passata lì, sì,
Ma tanto che si vede magari solo questa parte,
ma poi chi se ne frega,
Sì, più o meno all'altezza della sedia. Sì, sì.
braccio,
Vai, ancora? Sì, si vede un pochettino.
Sì,
le
ma
manine,
sì, ma neanche.
sì.
Sì, va pochissimo.
Mamma mia, dov'è il...
Cosa?
la cosa per vedere?
Sì, lì.
Ah,
sì.
ok.
Giusto.
No, che sto facendo questo?
Mamma mia. Non si vede proprio, non si vede.
No, è dentro proprio. Sì, certo.
Dentro
Ma
il...
lì mi sa che c'è proprio la levetta.
Sì.
Beh, non lo faccio. Lasciamola là.
La casa sta pensando che è successo.
Sì, basta. Non lo so. Marta.
Francesca.
C'è l'audio, no?
Sì. Sto pensando quando il professore dice Francesca. Ok.
Spero che si ricorda solo questo come nome. Francesca.
Do you understand?
Anche perché devo sempre stare attenta.
Sì, no.
Ogni volta.
Sì, magari che insomma un secondo mi distraggo con questa cosa del rating che mi ha chiesto. Un
E
secondo
poi
mi
non puoi più
distraggo.
chiedere, potresti
Francesca,
ripetere la domanda, per favore? Ti uccide
Ok,
subito,
Francesca, I will explain to you. Io penso lui dice così.
Francesca.
No.
Ah, però molto lui mi chiede come mi chiamo. Ma com'è questa storia che nessuno vuole sapere come
Adesso
mi
fai
chiamo?
come Fran, quando parla,
Chiedi.
Giulio Cesare, e parli qualcosa e... Come ti
Ma che gli
chiami?
altri capelli?
Sì, stamattina.
Cosa dicevo?
È un po' diverso, vero? Prima è un po' lungo.
Erano un po'
Sì,
lunghi,
così.
dicevo. Qualcosa di diverso.
Sperava.
Un po' bene.
Non so, non c'ho, no.
Wow.
Ah,
不是
太长了
你拉层次了，
没有，就是吹了一下而已。
感觉这边上层次，感觉短
他
长。
剪的稍微对。我这家总去，对我这家总去，我已经从他们家是7年了，在他们家。
Oh my god！
Hai capito? No, che...
Massimo capisco una parola sul discorso, però.
Brava.
Già va bene,
Brava.
Questa lingua, mamma mia.
No, secondo me non ci sentono, perché sennò uscirebbe il quadrato più.
Ah, ma magari stiamo un po' lontani.
Vabbè, ma perché si sente se parli sul microfono.
Sì, non
Vabbè,
si
prima
sente,
quando
non
ho
si
fatto
sente.
così non c'era.
Perché quando sono a casa, il professore quando muovi qui per spiegare qualcosa non mi sento niente a casa. Quindi sto
Sì, ma infatti
pensando...
ieri Sofia mi ha scritto e mi fa: ma cos'è che avete detto su quel grafico? Perché non ho capito bene, perché non si sentiva bene.
Ieri mattina anche io
C'hai
sono
ragione,
così.
non si sente
Esatto,
se
sì,
stai
sì,
qua.
Francesca.
Sì.
Francesca? Basta ora però. What is this? What is writing? Francesca.
Non sembra questo il Francesca.
Ora c'era con cos'è che dice? Fair.
Fair oggi.
Sì.
There's no fair.
Not
strano.
fair.
You have
a question.
a question.
A question. You know what? Die Teaser so, fine,
Ma lui già parla abbastanza inglese bene.
Sì,
Benissimo.
Poi
benissimo.
carino.
Vabbè, poi se tornano a New York, ci stanno in Francia, sicuramente sa anche il francese.
Sì.
No, di tanto pare.
Vabbè, sembra. Sì, ogni tanto magari qualche
francese,
pronuncia un po'
sì.
discutibile, però sicuramente molto molto preparato.
Sì.
Mamma mia.
Poi che
Si
sa
vede
tutto
che
già
sa le
qua.
cose che diciamo che uno, cioè non è come
Competente.
altri che magari leggevano le slide.
Sì,
Sì.
esatto, gli altri magari leggevano le slide.
Slide.
Esatta leggeva le slide e
Mi
basta.
sembra questi slide è un cosa additivo per lui.
sì,
Lui
sì,
può
lui
parlare
spiega.
già
Si
senza
parla e poi dopo gira le slide.
Certo.
Sì, no, infatti questa
devo
cosa,
cambiare.
il fatto che lui non legga solamente le slide,
Sì.
ma faccia proprio un discorso,
Sì,
cioè
sì.
almeno ti fa capire quello che è, vuole trasmettere.
Esatto. Ita.
Se mi piacciono non mi piace.
Comunque quando vedo live vedo quel numero matricola penso solo a quella scena di ieri.
No, scena. Anche da casa l'avete visto?
Lei non ha visto perché l'ha ricordato mare l'orario.
No,
Quindi non l'ha visto.
stamattina
Vabbè,
sto
meglio per
facendo
te,
parte dall'altro. Ho visto il
Sì, no, perché qua
Sì. Perché
Bellissimo.
lo
Mi ricordo ancora
lo
un
ricordo
po',
per
no?
come ora, oggi. Quindi io pensavo ai 12, ma no.
Che scena brutta.
maglia bianca. Non ricordo le altre cose. Capelli corti. Niente altro.
Aiuto.
Sembra buono.
Secondo me ne fa un'altra di pausa, però boh.
Dici? No, io vorrei che filmeremo. Spero.
Sì.
Secondo me ne fa un'altra.
Almeno ancora, sì,
Fino
almeno
alle
ancora
6.
Mo abbiamo fatto un'ora e mezza.
Sono 58 che ho fatto io, non so neanche cosa serve. Cioè, lui è stato tipo 3 capitoli
Davvero?
Già?
credo sia una parte che facciamo.
Mamma mia.
E ci sono 6 autori, guardi. Sono 2, 3, 4, 5 autori. Ho fatto 12 capitoli in testa.
Beh, non sapevano cosa fare, hanno detto vabbè dai.
Scriviamo un libro.
ognuno fa la sua parte e poi il resto...
Come il nostro progetto con la razzarda.
Ma sì, noi abbiamo fatto ognuno la propria parte, poi collage mettiamo insieme.
Ed I'm going to GC, io penso.
Devi passare, vai.
Io pure.
Quanto sono scomodi questi segni?
Troppo, madonna. Ma poi...
Durissimo.
Ah, io questa cosa non l'ho vista.
Nel senso...
Da qua?
No, no, gli anni scorsi invece c'erano più posti segnalati con rilasciare. Per
O mi sedevo in punta e allora non mi sono mai fatta.
Vabbè, ci sono dei banchi di ufficio.
Sì, no, infatti. Avevo un livello di scomodità.
Sam Caspirone.
还是瞌睡吗？你再不睡觉不行了已经，咖啡已经救不了你了。对。吃那个能量棒，宝贝。吃能量棒试一下，我跟你说。
现在你帮我刚才吃了多少？
我觉得吃糖会不会好一点？
对，会有一点糖。
Perché sono carite no? Da piccolo mi ha messo una prestazione da giochiera. Queste che sono sempre quelle urgenze, si dice che ne so, ma te le fa
Dipende dall'orario del treno, devi andare a Torino, a Milano, a Chiara parte. Controlliamo? Sì. Intero. Guarda che la porta nuova. Porca nuova. No, la porta nuova, per forza. Ho trovato questo o questo? O questo?
No,
vabbè, ma tanto hai ragione.
Eccoci qua. Ristorati? Non mi accontentate. Cosa sta mangiando in Quale? Napolitana? Lo hacker? Quale? Napolitana?
Nocciola.
Maxi.
Non fai? Cos'è sta roba? Sono buoni anche i napoletani. Quelli bianchi buonissimi. No?
Questo.
Che donna dura. Comunque mi diverto qua ragazzi, adesso volevo ringraziare perché mi diverto oggi. Non abbiamo imparato niente, ma almeno quando è stato qui. Siete fantastici. Io sto raffreddore come di ora. Scusate. A casa sono sempre. Ci sono. Allora cari amici, che incedere la Valchiria. Grazie Francesca, è un tesoro, fossi più giovane sposerei. Ho detta grossa. In effetti non sei critico. Non ti offendere. Avete domande? Sì, ditemi di sì, perché se no devo parlare io. Alex, hai qualche domanda? Come no? Inventati qualcosa, dai. No, invece siamo giunti avete capito, a uno snodo cruciale di questa parte del corso. Il trade-off model è uno snodo cruciale. Quello che volevo dirvi è che da un punto di vista poi del caso Diageo, che probabilmente non ne sono sicuro, non so se lanciarlo oppure no, non dal balcone, ma quasi, vorrei far presentare e discutere con voi al dottor Nirino per dargli una possibilità anche di confrontarsi con noi, no? Già mai in lingua inglese, cioè c'ha 4 risate. È un'occasione per farsi 4 risate. No, dilettate allo sbaraglio, che dite? Oppure lo presento io. Vediamo come va. Se lo vedo, intervengo, se no poverino si mette in difficoltà. Va bene, per cui is in the other room preparing the case. In castigo. But Diageo case actually, I forgot that this is an English course, I'm sorry. Diageo case is about the application of something equivalent to this, which is well, actually, sapete cosa? Come piace scrivere, io scrivo. Il problema è tornare. Adesso vediamo. Dunque. Cominciamo male. Hai un momento lì. C'è il nostro Max?
No.
Non c'è problema. Ma schifato dalla lezione di ieri.
Online.
Che c'è problema?
No, we saw that there are companies without apps, only app. But can be a company
No.
having only that.
Queste società sono fallite. 100% dead, 0% equity, you are dead.
I was looking by a mathematical point of view, the over
Mathematically, theoretically, yes, but in practice, a company that has 0 equity is a company that is smart. Mi spiace. Sei deluso? So we're gonna no, actually it's not via video, it's okay, but we have to go here. First of all this one. Ok, ma poi devo interrompere un attimo, poi giusto? Tac. E tac.
Okay.
No, it worked. At home they're seeing this.
Yes.
No. But this is a very lucky day, so it works. Okay, guys, so unbelievable. Well, actually, what I wanted to show you, I forgot. Okay, not just to use the same notation. We can put all the pieces of the puzzle together. Okay, I hope you remember that we are finally interested in knowing and maximizing the enterprise value. Francesca, ci sei? And according to the trade-off model, this is another way of saying it's always the same thing. It's amazing how many different ways you can say the same thing. The maximize the enterprise value is like saying, it could be said also this way. It means that you have you estimate the value of the firm as if 100% equity financed. Okay, so the value of the firm asset side. Okay, means now I don't want to go back to the slides because otherwise the equilibrium is so precarious that it's better to. You remember the asset side, the picture, the asset side. Okay, it means the value of the firm as if 100% equity finance, and then we add the present value of tax shields. This is the gross, but we also need to subtract the present value of financial distress costs. This is a cons. This is a balance. There's a balance between the two that gives birth to the trade off model. Okay? The good news means green light. The more you have it, the happier you are. And then there is the red light. The less you have, the better you are off. The balance between the two is the trade-off model. It's the optimal capital structure according to the trade-off model. Okay? Which in turn, let me switch again to. Can I go back to the slides?
Devi rifare, prof.
Dici?
Di là deve girare male. Ok.
That's exactly what it is written here, and this representation can be also provided graphically, which is the one that you see here. The one that you see here says that the optimal debt ratio is where the added value on top of the value for equity finance, which is given, it's given, you see it's always, okay. The more you move on the right, the more you have an additional portion of value, this part here, that is given by the present value of the tax shield. Then, from a certain point on, it becomes partially eroded by the present value cost of financial distress, so that you have two contrasting forces. The tax shield of debt that would say, go for additional debt. But then on the other side, the financial distress costs that say, no, stop with the leverage, okay? Two confronting forces, okay? At the beginning, the first one gains, but then the strength, the more you move toward the right of the graph, the strength of the financial distress cost increases, and at a certain point, it overwhelms the advantages of that, okay? And that certain point means that you cannot leverage more. And that's your optimal debt equity ratio. It's a three-card trick. Professor, you already said that 3 times at least. Is that correct? Correct. But just to emphasize the importance of the concept. Okay. Now let me leverage a little bit. Okay. Let me leverage a little bit on the intuition, amazing and unbelievable intuition of Alex that he said before. He mentioned the word signals. Right? He made an intervention on signals. There's another, we have exhausted the trade-off model. We are now over the trade-off. There was an additional part that I would like to comment that could help us explaining why companies, differently from the original propositions of Montiani and Miller, they care a lot about the financial policy that they adopt. Another reason for justifying the fact that companies pay a lot of attention on their capital structure is the signal or signal effect that capital structure decisions may have on the value of the firm. What do I mean with that? Tan, take a look at it. Don't get distracted. You're reading too much, too intensively the slide. It is very simple. I hope I don't have to convince you. Sono contagiato? Solo io l'untore. Eh sì. Un po' d'acqua? E quella contagiata. E poi c'è chi beve l'acqua della Madonna e chi beve l'acqua contagiata, la tua è contagiata. Mi sono dimenticato. Ok. I hope I don't have to convince you that by signaling some financial decisions, you are sending a signal to the market, and the market could interpret the signal positively or negatively. Let me give you a couple of examples. The first, well, not an example, are questions for you. Suppose that a company decides to go for a capital increase. In other words, the company decides to issue new shares to be sold on the market. You probably know, probably it's because you never know, but you should know. You probably know that according to our civil code, when you increase the capital, it means when you increase the number of shares outstanding, you should offer those shares first and foremost to the already existing shareholders, the so famous diritto di opzione. Article 2441 of the Italian Civil Code. It's called in in Anglo-Saxon language, rights offering. Rights offering. Okay? Now, suppose that you are a listed firm. It means that your shares are traded on the stock market. And suddenly you publish a press release, okay, that says, I am, I don't know, Telecom Italia, not Telecom Italia is wrong, say, a company X, generic company X, that says, in the next 15 days, we're going to increase the capital of our company. Okay, we are issuing 100 million shares, new shares, at this price, okay, that will be offered first and foremost to the existing shareholders. In case shareholders are not interested, they are free to sell these rights to the market and let other people buy the shares. Then there is a sentence at the end of the press release. Suppose that I am the major shareholder of the company. Mr. Antonio Salvi has already declared that his percentage of rights will be exercised and he will take part to the pro quota, take part to the capital increase. Okay? Do you think that this statement, the final one, this statement in the press release will be interpreted positively or negatively by the market?
If I'm not mistaken, when you issue the rights, it doesn't increase the capital value of the company.
The capital?
The value of. So if you rights issue means that you're increasing the number of shares, but at the same time, money are not coming to the company. If I'm not mistaken.
You are mistaken.
Okay, then I'm just silent.
No, what you're referring to is the so-called bonus shares, which is, let me say, you're Italian. Ah, okay. But by the way, for the Italians, l'aumento di capitale gratuito, when you actually don't receive, you issue shares which are actually obtained by dividing the existing shares. It's called bonus shares in English, in Italian aumento di capitale gratuito. It's a way of increasing the capital on paper, not cash-based. What I'm referring to, it's a traditional good old way of increasing the capital, selling new shares, so getting additional cash in the company. The only thing that I'm saying is that rather than offering these shares to anonymous investors on the market, you first and foremost offer them, as it is the rule in Europe, you offer those shares to the already existing shareholders pro quota. Okay? And what I'm saying is that the press release, it is obliged to say that, at the end of the press release says, Mr. Antonio Salvi, the major shareholder of our company, has already declared his intention to subscribe his percentage of shares in the capital increase. Do you think that the market will consider this sentence in the press release as a positive signal or a negative signal?
Positive.
Positive?
I don't know, looks like a threat.
It looks like?
A threat.
Ma chi è? Ma cos'hai oggi? Ma che cosa gli avete fatto? Ma è un ragazzo a modino, ma lo state cambiando. A trap? It could be, I understand, it's a trap. So you say something, but you do it differently.
I don't know, it looks
Sei
like
deformato.
you want to influence the judgment of the
Ho capito, no, this is criminal behavior because you are, I'm not kidding, because you are, come si dice, I don't remember the Italian, c'è un reato per questo, che manipolazione, sì, manipolazione del mercato, penso si chiama manipolazione del mercato, because you deliberately are sending price sensitive news wrongly in order to affect the behavior of investors. This is a criminal behavior, right? Bravo. We don't want you to read the Padre Galere soon because we will come and visit you, but come on. No, normally, unless you are a criminal, normally what you say you do, unless there are very adverse causes in the meanwhile, the breakdown of a war, or I don't know, but there should be really something totally unexpected and absolutely abnormal. But if Antonio Salvi has declared, and this is officially reported to the CONSOB or the Stock Market Authority, the stock market per se, and if I am a financial intermediary even to the Bank of Italy and to the other authorities that control, and you said it because you simply want to do something improper, this is seriously negative behavior. But apart from this perversion that he has, normal people here, they have answered positive, right?
Yeah.
Are you sure what you say? Mi ricordi il tuo nome?
Claudia, Toscano.
Claudia Toscano, benissimo, prego.
As an external potential shareholder, looking that an internal shareholder believe in the company, the external are more confident to buy new shares.
Do you agree with Claudia? Yeah, exactly. It's a sic et simpliciter this way. You're sending a signal of confidence. Let's put it the other way around, just following his criminal behavior. Suppose that Antonio Salvi says, Mr. Salvi has declared that as being the major shareholder, the most important shareholder, has declared that he doesn't care about the capital, he leaves others to subscribe the shares. Wow, you're sending a message. You are the owner of the firm and you are not the first one to believe in your company. You want us to subscribe the shares rather than you. Go to that village. Giusto? Exactly. Claudia and the rest of you are absolutely right. Francesca, what's wrong?
No.
Vedo seccata.
No.
Sicuro?
Sì, sto ascoltando.
Hai indicato un fidanzato? Ma mandala a quel paese. Tutta gente di uomini. Lascia stare. Ora di me. Fidati. Molto bene. Why did I mention this example, Tan? I mentioned this example as an example of the link between signals to the market and capital structure decisions. Actually, you may argue, Tan, I know what you're wondering. This is not exactly a capital structure decision, it's a decision about the individual behavior of a person that within a certain decision states his or her opinion. And I agree with you. So let me show you a second example. Suppose that you are my company, the same company, I want to grow externally. I want to make an acquisition. Okay? And I need to raise cash for financing the acquisition. Because I don't have enough money inside, and I don't want to make an exchange of shares. I need to raise money. I'm a listed firm. I'm obliged to communicate to the market my intention to take over company Y or Z. Okay? And in the press release, I'm also obliged to say obliged. It is good old common sense to specify also how am I gonna pay this acquisition, for this acquisition. And suppose that I say that there are two possible press releases that I could adopt. Press release number one. This acquisition will cost us 500 million euros that will be paid entirely cash. Great. Alternative one. Or alternative B. This acquisition will be paid 500 million euros cash, of which 10% will be invested directly by the major shareholders. Do you think that the market would react more positively with the second statement or the first one? It's even simpler than the previous one, right? No, ragazzi. In the first case, I don't specify anything about who puts the money. We need money, I will find the money, I will find 500, the company will find 500 million euros, and that's it. In the second one, I'm saying 500 million euros, of which 50 million, 10%, will be provided by the major shareholder. Bravo. Why? Prego, mi dici il tuo nome?
Corinne.
Corinne, alla francese? Bravissimo. Cognome?
Bonesio.
Ma sei francese? E da dove arrivi?
No, mi dispiace, da qua, da Torino.
Esiste un torinese? No,
Ci sta, sì.
Lì, sei proprio una torinese doc.
No.
Why did you say correctly that the second one is going to be better than the first one?
Because there are more details. When you provide more details, people are more confident, no?
Because it's the major shareholder.
Ecco l'avvoltoio di fianco. Voi siete amiche, ma lei non vede l'ora di farti le scarpe.
I think that because it's the major shareholder.
It's exactly the same reason as before.
Okay.
Wow, if you really believe in this acquisition. If you invest 50 million of your own money, it means you're sending a signal to the bank. Wow, if you invest 50 million euros, it means that this must be a good acquisition, because otherwise you would stay at home, right? He's an insider of the firm. He knows everything. He's the major shareholder. He knows what he's dealing with, and if he believes that he can put on the table his own money, 50 million euros, well, probably there's a high probability that he is definitely confident that this is going to be a good acquisition. The second example shows you an example of a different capital structure, because in this case you don't simply put 50 million euros cash if you are the shareholder. It means that you need to increase the capital or to make a shareholder's loan, it's called. And this modifies the capital structure. Okay? So, I don't want to elaborate any further on the signals, leverage as a credible signal. The last thing I want to say is that there is which basically reflects what's written here, there is a school of thought, according to which, in some cases, I cannot go back to what I wrote before, but you have it clearly in your mind. Remember the U-shaped curve, okay? There is a school of thought that says that sometimes companies, let's go back to what Alex and Al Capone was saying before. Sometimes companies deliberately decide to, how can I say, to position themselves, to position themselves to a rather high level of leverage, sometimes even higher than the minimum point, because by doing so, if they explain it correctly to the market, they are sending a signal, okay, that they believe that the future will be bright, and they are able to face such a relatively high level of interest expenses because the future of the firm is bright. Let me put it differently, Alex. Assuming, it's a strong assumption here, that I behave legally properly, okay? Do you believe, it's a rhetorical question, do you believe that I am the entrepreneur, I tend to raise a lot of money from banks or whatever, if and when I know that the company doesn't have a bright side future ahead of her? No, because I know that if tomorrow is going to be cloudy for my firm, I will not have enough money to repay the debt. Conversely, if tomorrow is going to be better than today, but it's not because I'm reading the crystal ball, I have good arguments for supporting the fact that I believe that the future will be brighter than today, okay? In that case, I could afford is the right word, having more debt, because I know that I will be able to face that amount of debt. Understand what I mean? So, if I announce an increase of debt on the market, and I explain it appropriately, that's the role of the investor relations manager, I explain it appropriately, I could convince the market that the fact that I am exaggerating somehow with the leverage that I have according to the trade-off model is deliberately done because the future will be better than today. It's a signal about the future perspectives of the firm, the future growth of the firm. Even, this is so true that it applies also to all of us as individuals. Let's consider you as a group. You are ending your studies, you will be working soon, and I wish you that you will work doing first and foremost what you want to do, and that you will be happy in doing what you do, and presumably if everything works on average properly, you should have a progressively increasing salary. Let's put it this way. More or less rapid, that's another story. But if you have, suppose that, now I don't know how old you are, 23, 24, 22, 25, whatever it is. Suppose that you reached an age of 30 years old and then you decide to buy an apartment for yourself. You need to borrow, to take a loan normally for buying the apartment. The question that I'm asking you is rhetorical again. Suppose that you are just in the middle of a rapid growth of your career. You know that you are positive about your career because you are. Everybody loves you. You have waited the appropriate number of years in order to have the so-called scatto, the upgrade. Everything seems, but something grounded, real. Everything seems promising for tomorrow. Would you ask for a lower or a higher, smaller or higher or bigger loan for your firm from your bank and in order to buy the apartment? Suppose you have to pay 200,000 euros, okay? You put 20%, which is 40,000 euros cash, the rest could be a loan. But you are rather rich, you say, you know what, I have more than 40,000 euros, I have 80,000 euros or 50,000 euros. I want to put an initial fish on the table bigger than the 40,000 euros required by the bank, and the rest is going to be a loan. When do you think that you're going to make this bet? More likely. future will be bright. If you know that, unless you are that guy, che says, no, bravo, invece è esattamente il contrario. When I believe that tomorrow morning I'm going to be fired, I will ask for the maximum loan to the bank, right? Because I know, you know the old saying that says, if Antonio Salvi has a 1,000 euros debt with a bank, Antonio Salvi has a problem. If Antonio Salvi has a 10 million euros debt with the bank has a problem. No? And that's exactly our philosophy, right? But we are a minority of outliers on the verge of criminal behavior. Normal people would say, well, you know what? Since I believe that in the future is going to be right busy, why should I invest all my money? Since I know that I can afford having this loan because the future will be even better than today. If I can do it today, imagine tomorrow. Okay? By doing so, you're not sending a signal to anybody, you're sending a signal to yourself on the mirror. But that's another story. But for companies that do this kind of, they act this way, they're sending a signal to the market saying exactly what I just mentioned before, that you believe that your company is going to have a brighter future so that you can now afford having a higher level of debt than expected. Perché mi guarda così? Vabbè, no. Okay? That's it. Okay. Well, that's it. That's it. Almost. That's it with the big magical world of the trade-off model. Now we have to move toward the pecking order theory or model, call it as you prefer, okay? Which is an alternative model to the trade-off model. Okay? This model was first elaborated according to those who don't know about finance in 1977, following an article of Stuart Myers, but actually those who know about finance, they know that these were things already mentioned by Gordon Donaldson in a book of 1969. But also, if I may say, in some Italian authors, for example, Luigi Quadri, Pellegrino Capaldo, in a couple of interesting books which were about the kind of structure of fund. But this is totally just a note, okay? What does the pecking order theory say? According to the pecking order theory, let me move a little bit this on the right, otherwise you cannot see. Okay. Well, the pecking order theory starts from observing what happens in reality, right? And it discovers something quite intuitive, on which I hope there won't be a fight between me and you, okay, according to which internal funds means funds are generated internally by the firm, okay. They are the cheapest to use. Why? Because they are not associated with any issuance costs, any fees given to intermediaries. Okay. Second, you can use these internal funds whenever you want without providing any explanation to a third party. It's your decision. You do whatever you want with your money. You don't have to release any information to the public because that's your money. Alternatively, if you go, for example, for a capital increase, we were recommending capital increase. When you go for a capital increase, you need to issue a prospectus. You need to say why you want to do this capital increase, what you want to do with this money, blah blah. What the major shareholder is expected to do concerning this capital. There is a lot of information that you need to provide that it discloses some information that sometimes you don't want to disclose. Okay. Third, internal funds can be rapidly and easily mobilized. Mobilized means mobilizzati. Okay. I'm talking to the Italians, only to the Italians for 1 second. I capitali non si mobilitano, si mobilizzano. Le masse si mobilitano, non i capitali. Okay. Si legge spesso questo errore. Così. So to mobilize means to mobilizzare in Italian, okay? And fourth and final thing is that internal funds, they do not affect anyhow the control of the firm. Antonio, could you qualify a little bit more this apparently important statement? Sure, I can. The idea is very simple. You remember when I said, let's suppose that a company wants to increase the capital, right? When you increase the capital, and if you are in EU, in the European Union, I don't know, frankly, about China and other countries. I know about Europe and North America. So, but it should be one of the two. It should be one of the two that I'm going to mention. If you are in Europe, the standard way of increasing capital is by means of rights issue. Diritto di opzione. If you are in Anglo-Saxon countries, the standard way of increasing capital is a cash offer. Cash offer means that you, from scratch, sell your shares directly to the public with no option rights offered to anybody. Okay? Let's for 1 second consider, for simplicity, because we are all becoming tired this afternoon, let's consider the cash offer, the American way of increasing capital. Okay? If you go for the American way, you, existing shareholder, already old shareholder, you may suffer a danger. The danger is the fact that if other, as it normally happens, other shareholders, new, totally unknown shareholders that subscribe the shares, you get diluted. Diluted means that your percentage in the capital structure of the firm is going to be lower. You used to have 30% of shares. Now there are new shareholders coming in, subscribing a rather important amount of shares. Your percentage is going to be lower, right? You don't need to be a wizard again to understand this. Good old common sense. By using internal funds, you don't suffer any kind of these problems because you are using your own funds. The shareholder composition remains unchanged, and everybody, like in fairy tales, live happily, right? And that's another plus, according to some observers, concerning the internal funds. Let me skip the second one. Let me go straight to the point. If that's the case, in other words, if these four, and probably also other elements could be considered, if these four factors actually work, four factors means the four that you see over there, companies should prefer to self-financing the new investments. Okay? And whenever they can do that, they do it. If they're not able to do it, then they open the capital to external sources. So, we go back to oggi sono un pochino strano. 1 second, ci provo. Non faccio proprio la velocità.
Which of methods?
1 second. Questo è delicate. Sure, 1 second. Funziona? No, come? Prego.
Which of these two methods, let's say, incentives to have higher quality of debt? I mean,
Which methods? Which of the two?
Yeah, let's say the American one and the European one.
Which of these two alternatives? What was this? The second part?
Has to have a higher qualitative, cioè una qualità più alta nel senso quanto è sana l'azienda,
Una qualità più alta di cosa?
il debito, nel senso no,
Decisamente.
lasciamo fare.
Siamo tutti stanchi, ragazzi. Lui con la mentalità vera, l'altro con la bladera. Io mi impappino su delle cose, non si capisce questo ragazzi. Corretto.
Fate un quarto.
Figurati nel sole 6. No, we will not reach 6 o'clock, ok? Guarda, stai tranquillo. Vabbè, guarda così. Come dire, finirà sta cazzo. Now, Let's make an experiment, my dear friends, and let's hope that it works. Normally it works. So concentrate yourself. Suppose that we own a company. Okay, we all own a company. We are considered, it's a small firm. It was created by us. We believe in this company. We love it. Blah, blah, blah. We are now considering of making a new investment. For example, buying a new machinery. It's quite costly. It's quite costly. We want to buy a new machinery. This machinery costs 10 million euros. Adesso un po' meno.
Sì, deve abbassare. Deve scendere lentamente il foglio.
Foglio.
Scendere.
Molto. 10 milioni di euro. Okay. You are the owner of this firm. You have deciding if it is worth going for this 10 million euros new machinery or not. It's 6 o'clock, winter time, you are in your office, alone, and you must decide. Actually, the real decision is, I believe that this machinery is a valuable one. We should go for it. But there is a problem. But there could be a problem. Which one? I need to find the money in order to pay these 10 million euros. That's the problem. What do you think? And so he or she struggles to raise these 10 million euros. What do you think is the first thing that Mr. Entrepreneur does, or Mrs. Entrepreneur does for seeing if it is feasible or not to buy this new machinery? The first thing.
You check how much you can put inside.
Angela, what you say is absolutely fair, exactly. So he calls his ragioniere, I am a ragioniere, so he calls his ragioniere and says, Ragioniere, yes? Can you just go online 1 second? No, more or less. Online 1 second, see how much money do we have in our bank account? Un momento, dottore, sempre dottore. One moment, dottore, 1 second. Yes, 5 minutes later, he says, okay, I believe that we have around 5 million euros. Let's say internal funds. Internal means our funds. Internal funds. Okay. He hangs the phone and he said, what can I do now? 5 million euros. What do you think it happens now? There are two alternatives, right? Alternative number one. I mentioned the first alternative, you mentioned the second one. Alternative number one, sti cazzi. The Roman way that I mentioned yesterday. Non lo facciamo. Simple, right? There is no prescription from the doctor that says you must buy this machinery. You don't have the money, you don't do it, right? No. And I go to the park or whatever to use these 5 million euros to get drunk. Next year we'll see. In the meanwhile,
We can buy lottery tickets.
Lottery tickets. You got it, eh? Or alternatively, suppose that you are like Angela, stubborn type. So no, io lo devo fare, I must do it. What could you do now? Let me put it differently so that the experiment works. What do you think that the average entrepreneur on this planet would do now in order to find the additional remaining 5 millions that he still needs?
We check the interest rate on the debt.
Sorry?
We check the interest rate on the debt.
But it's you. It's the masculine. I thought she was me. Sorry. Say it again.
check the interest rate on debt acquisition? Like how much will it cost to him to get a debt?
So if I interpret your thoughts correctly, he would knock on the door of a bank.
Or, yeah, sure.
To knock on the door, I mean, not literally, but he would ask for bank loan.
Yeah.
Exactly. There is somebody that saved your dignity. What's your name?
Maria.
Maria. Come mia mamma che bel nome. So you go for bank debt. Now, suppose you wait, now banks are closed. Yeah, they're closed. You wait, tomorrow morning, I go and see the bank. I present the idea. Sorry if I oversimplify, but that's the way it goes. So the director of the agency, I need to buy this machine because it's a new promising one, it's ESG, it's sustainable, so blah, 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 blah. What's the cost of this machine? 10 million euros. How do you think you're going to finance this purchase? Say, you know what, I want to show my commitment. We're going to use 5 millions of ourselves, sending a signal of commitment. Oh, that's good. The bank appreciates this, right? Says, bravo, se siamo complici è meglio. Così. Say, how much do you still need? 10 million minus 5 is 5, right? I see. Let me see. Give me all the instructions, I open the dossier, blah, 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 blah. Let's meet next week, and I will tell you what happens. Okay, great. 1 week passes. After 1 week, it goes back to the bank, and the bank says, I have good news for you. We have, we have agreed to give you a portion of what you still need. What do you mean a portion? I mean that given all the elements of the machinery, blah, 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 the maximum we can give you is 3 million. Okay? He starts swearing internally. And say, can we do something? No, unfortunately, we cannot do more than 3 million euros. You go back home, say, I may have a problem, right, Claudia? But again, there are two alternatives now. You go again to the pub after 1 week. Say, no, pub, drunk. Or, if you are stubborn, Corinne, what would you do?
Go to the shareholders.
Okay. Third alternative, for the missing 2 million euros probably, you would increase the capital. Ok? Molto bene ragazzi, è finito l'esperimento. The experiment is over. If that's the case, you say that there is a ranking. First, in the rank, you look internally. Second, you knock on the door of banks. Third, if needed, you increase the capital. That's a pecking order. That's an order. There's a ranking of means of financing according to this model, according to which entrepreneurs on average behave this way. This is really the basic model that can be presented concerning pecking order. Then we could elaborate a little bit more. It's more sophisticated version of this model, let's say bank debt or in general debt that which one ranks first, bank or bonds? No? So normally banks rank ahead of bonds. So there's first, second, third, fourth. And there is preferred shares, ordinary shares. It can be complicated. But the story remains the same. The story says that in the heart, in the brain, and in the wallet of the entrepreneurs, of the or the shareholders in general, when they have to finance a new investment, they have a clear ranking of means of financing in their mind. And there is huge evidence showing that what you said is what happens on average. Okay? Now you may be wondering, as always, who cares? We insist on these things, but what are the consequences of this model? The consequences are rather important, even if we simply compare this model, the pecking order I mean, with the trade-off model. Think about it. If we if we believe that the pecking order model is the right one, that could be helpful in understanding the capital structure decisions of firms, there could be a lot of circumstances in which the company does not have any debt at all. By definition. If I want to make a new investment and I have 12 million euros cash available, I don't need to go to step 2. I can stop here. Because I have enough money for self-financing all the investments. And if a company generates on a recurring basis a lot of internal cash, the probability that this company doesn't need to raise money from external sources is higher. This model, by the way, this differentiates the sources between internal, which is actually the first one, and external. Ok? Però che brutto sto blu. Madonna. Non dite niente. Un blu sciacquetto. So, differently from the trade-off model, according to which I hope you remember, there is always an optimal debt equity ratio, D star, you remember, that can be found and that normally would imply a certain amount of debt within the capital structure of the firm. According to the pecking order model, this is something that is not necessarily true. Actually, the decision here is taken, the capital structural decision is taken not only it's wrong, not by following the pros and cons of that financing, the tax advantage, the bankruptcy cost, blah, 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 blah. It's taken on, do I have the money or no? If I have the money, I use it. If I don't have the money, I ask to somebody else. It's very simple, okay? Let me go back to second to the slides. The camera here. Condividi. Microsoft. Ho fatto tutto bene?
Sì.
Increase also the sides. So you see rule number 1, rule number 2, rule number 3 is exactly what we saw before, huh? Okay. What are now we are commenting the red lines here. And I told you that there is no target debt equity ratio, differently from the prescriptions of the trade-off model. Second, which is an evidence that is quite common in practice, very common in practice I would say, that generally speaking, profitable firms tend to use lower level debts. It's a fact. And this evidence can be explained by the pecking order model. You would have more difficulties in justifying this second statement using the trade-off model. Because presumably with the trade-off model what you would get is that profitable firms are firms which have reached a certain degree of maturity, they have some degree of assets that can be provided as collaterals. You would expect these companies to borrow more, actually, rather than less. And according to the evidence that we have, actually profitable firms, there are exceptions of course, but on average they tend to borrow less. And this is something that can be explained by the pecking order model. Because the pecking order model, dear Claudia, says that whenever I see that your eyes are falling, I call your name. Okay? It says that if the company is profitable, it generates cash internally, right? And if it generates cash internally, you don't need to go elsewhere, knock on the door of anybody. Third, Microsoft example I was mentioning before the interview, remember, to the CFO. Companies like financial slack. Slack means financial, a little bit of excess cash. They like it. Like Zio Paperone in the deposit, they like diving a little bit. You know. Yeah, it makes you more confident, feel safer. You like diving into a mountain of money, right? But actually, going beyond metaphor, you now understand that, I cannot show you that again, I'm sorry. But if you have an unexpected opportunity of investing in a new machinery of 10 million euros, which you believe, wow, this is the right time to do it, and we must do it now, because for different reasons tomorrow could be too late, you need to have the cash on hand for doing it. Because if you need 10 million euros and you have it in your company, tomorrow morning, literally, you can buy the machinery. If you need to ask money to other people or other institutions, it takes time, first. Second, and the result is uncertain. You don't know if and how much they will give you. So companies, that's why this model also explains, helps us explaining why some companies deliberately prefer to keep some excess cash within the asset side of the financial statements. Fourth, control is valuable. As I told you before, if we go back to the example 10 million euros and between step number 1, internal funds, step number 2, banks, you're able to reach 10 million euros, you don't have to care about the possible dilution of control that follows the fact that your company, that you need to increase the capital and sell the shares to other shareholders. Okay? Now the problem is, no, sorry. The problem, it's not a problem, it's an opportunity. The problem is, how much cash should a company have? How do we know if a company has excess cash? How many resources can a company raise, mobilize, okay, in order to finance new investments? What I want to share with you now is how to estimate the, let me say, financial flexibility of the firm. Financial flexibility, now you understand what I mean. Internal financial flexibility means having the resources, mobilizing the resources that suddenly you need to have in order to catch some unexpected opportunities. Okay? And this is something that we're going to examine after 10 minutes break. Sì, no, ragazzi, qua la temperatura è salita. Non la volete fare il break? Dobbiamo finire molto prima? 16:35, 10 minuti, 16:45, 17:30, 17:45 ce l'abbiamo, va bene? Ok. Signora Corinne, sulla sua disposizione. Per due, diciamo, almeno 2 o 3 giorni. Non necessariamente più importante del secondo, entrambi sono importanti. Il primo è che raccogliendo debito in alternativa al capitale, normalmente il grado di disclosure di informazioni finanziarie è inferiore rispetto a quello di capitale, soprattutto sulla società. Se secondo punto, che è esattamente collegato al primo, è che se tu invece di andare in banca aumenti il capitale, hai due alternative. Aumentare il capitale vuol dire o ci rimetti più dei tuoi, oppure devi trovare nuovi soci. Okay. Se ci rimetti tu è un problema, perché ci rimetti tu. Il problema nel senso che comunque sono soldi tuoi che vanno, magari potevi utilizzare per andare a fare pagoni, invece adesso funziona. Ancora peggio se invece li chiedi ad altri soci, perché in quel caso lì ti diluisci nel controllo dell'azienda. Questa è una cosa che mi piace.
Intanto pensavo, ma se lo si fa cercando magari le persone di finanza, però con diciamo delle clausole, chiamiamo così. Per esempio penso alle back option, nel senso che le dai sapendo che in 3 anni l'azienda se le ricompra. Più che altro escono gli stessi, cioè escono entrano gli stessi soldi e non paghi gli interessi alla banca.
Questo è un modo per ridurre la differenza tra secondo e se permettere il coglione Maria, di dove sei tu?
Sono russa.
Anche tu sei russo?
Anche chi altro?
No, non c'è più.
No, forse allora eri tu che ieri hai detto che eri russa.
No, non c'era nessuno.
Non c'era un'altra ragazza?
No, Repubblica Ceca, la ragazza.
Repubblica Ceca, poi c'è una serba.
Sì, che è più indietro.
Tedesco.
Sì, e lei.
E 2 cinesi.
Sì.
3.
Ah, la terza chi è? Ah, ce l'ho
Di là.
Sei russa di russo? Da quanto
Sì,
tempo?
sì, ma sono qui, ho finito la laurea triennale qui a Sa.
Ah, sei quasi, sei mezza italiana.
Anche mezzo tedesco.
Mezza ti trovi bene?
Cos'è?
Ti trovi bene?
Sì, sì, benissimo. Sì, sì. Ho scelto un paese proprio.
Ah, sul paese non ci sono.
Sì, volevo provare la dolce vita e ho ricevuto. Sì, perché certo che noi siamo tanti simili, però.
How do I want to spend this 1 hour with you? I want to spend this 1 hour basically on elaborating a little bit more on the pecking order model because it seems that you like it. And moving ahead. So the Agio case is going to be examined tomorrow, as expected. So you're perfectly on time. Just a quick digression. I told you that next week the second part of the course is going to be held by Professor Almeida. I'm not talking to you here, I'm talking to your friends at home. If you may show up, it would be highly appreciated. Not appreciated because I want the Trooper Camellati here. I don't care about that, but it's because it's a unique opportunity. You can miss me, it's okay. But missing Adol Almeida is really good. And the interaction that you have here is nothing compared to what you can get from home, I believe. And then there was a question, why are these people at home? It's a legitimate question, right? What is the average reason for which you are at home? Some of you are at home.
Mostly of them are not from Turin, so they're
So?
saving.
None.
They're cutting they're cutting expenses for them.
That's a good reason. That's a good reason. I understand that. Others, they're lazy. There's a good component. Cannot say that elsewhere.
Forse possono seguire.
Sì, sì.
Ah.
Meglio. Sì, sì. Sto mica offendendo, sto chiedendo. Tanto sei molto carino, molto cortese e garbata. Probably excessively cortese e garbata.
Magari qualcuno lavora.
Qualcuno lavora ma non segue proprio.
Non ho capito?
Qualcuno lavora e non segue proprio le lezioni, nel senso.
Ah, c'è anche questo? Ah, vabbè.
C'è anche colazione, sì.
Vabbè. Allora, veramente una cosa, come non ci sono. Ok, mi sembrano tutte motivazioni ragionevoli, per cui andiamo avanti. I may have good news for you, Angela, the fair lady.
Really? The change.
I'll let you know tomorrow.
Maybe. Esatto, può essere. Fa solo uno scritto per lei.
Sì, no, fa proprio la boccio però.
No, ma come professore?
Perché il gusto di bocciare. Hai fatto scrivere, diciamo solo per te. Allora, okay. Now that the final two have arrived, I would say that we need to focus our attention on the internal funds. Since we know that they rank first, internal funds rank first in the heart of entrepreneurs, we need to elaborate a little bit more about what we mean with internal funds. And internal funds are basically, this slide says, that are basically made up of three components. The three that you see mentioned over there. The so-called surplus or excess cash, surplus assets, and residual debt capacity. So, the overall internal funds, that I prefer, more than internal funds, I prefer to call it the financial flexibility of the firm, is made up of three components. And these three components are, again, surplus cash or excess cash, they're alternatively named these two ways, surplus assets, and residual debt capacity. What do we mean with the first, the second, and the third? Let's start from the third because it's going to be easier. I didn't mention that, but there are two plus signs, surplus cash plus surplus assets plus residual debt capacity, which means that it's the sum of these three things that could help us defining the financial flexibility or the internal funds of a firm. Let's start with the third one, which is residual debt capacity. What is a residual debt capacity? A residual debt capacity is a residual debt capacity. Giusto? Which means that if companies have, for example, non-exhausted credit lines obtained by the bank, which have not yet been used, that part which has not yet been used is part of the residual debt capacity. Or, more broadly speaking, if the company has literally residual borrowing capacity, it means that it has not borrowed so far up to the maximum point that it could borrow, that difference missing is a residual, a marginal borrowing capacity that the company has. So in other words, if I am a company and I know because I have applied some models, some credit scoring techniques and so on and so forth, that the maximum amount of debt that I may be able to raise from banks is 10 million euros. But so far I have asked to my banks 3 million euros. I know that my residual borrowing capacity is 7 million euros. Okay? So the residual debt capacity is the maximum amount of debt that a company may raise as is. Maria, capito? And that's it for component 3. There's nothing else that needs to be said. Probably what we can elaborate now, some comments on, is on surplus assets. The second element that you see mentioned here. What do we mean with surplus assets? As the name says, surplus assets, one second. Surplus assets are the assets that can be defined differently. Which way could be more? Surplus assets are those assets that the company can get rid of without hampering its survival. Too much sophisticated? Let's make an example. You will immediately understand what I mean with surplus assets. Real examples. There is a company in Italy that produces pasta. It's the biggest producer of pasta. I don't want to mention the name, you mentioned it. Thank you very much. It's called Barilla. Barilla is a privately owned firm. It's not listed. It's still owned and managed by Barilla family. I had the opportunity of reading the balance sheet of Barilla some years ago, I must say, so to be honest with you, but I suppose that situation hasn't changed that much. In any case, when I used to read, for various reasons, the balance sheet of Barilla some years ago, I stumbled into a couple of things which were surprising to me. Actually, one thing especially was surprising to me, the fact that Barilla, the company owned some apartments I don't remember the number, but it was a remarkable number of apartments in the historical center of European cities. Paris, Rome, Milan, Madrid, Moscow, wherever, okay? That were these apartments, they were rented to private individuals, like myself, for example. Now, let me ask you a rhetorical question, Angela, you don't have to answer. Let me ask you a rhetorical question. Do you think that these apartments are operational apartments, or, let me say, a hobby that the company has with which it earns additional money, but it's not, it's a money that is not linked to the production of pasta and biscuits, the two major categories of products, no? Pasta and bakery products. This is what Barilla does. Some sauces, but 96% of the annual revenues of Barilla are shared between 50% pasta, 46% more or less, 46% is bakery products, Mulino Bianco, and 4% is the sughi pronti, come si chiamano, more or less. This is the real breakdown. Apartments in Siena or in Turin, what do they have in common with producing pasta? Zero. Right? Now, the rhetorical question that Angela would like to answer to show off a little bit, but she's absolutely, come si dice? Sostanza, impossibilità da farlo. You cannot answer. Is the following. Do you think that in case of need of Barilla, these apartments could be sold in order to raise cash without hampering the company Barilla producing pasta and bakery products? Question mark? It's a rhetorical. Yeah, the answer is yes. If your answer is yes, it means that those assets are surplus assets. You don't like the word surplus? Synonyms could be non-operational assets, complementary assets, basta, that's it. Non-operational probably is more technical. Okay, it differentiates operational from non-operational. Operation means those assets, machinery, plants, trucks, and so on that are needed for producing the pasta and the bakery products. But these things are totally redundant, if I may say. They are surplus assets. And they belong to the potential financial flexibility that the company has. In other words, if Mr. Barilla needs to raise a lot of money for the acquisition of Ferrero, I think it's the other way around, but in any case, suppose that they want to take over Ferrero and he needs to raise rapidly the money, needs to collect all the money as possible internally. He says, how much money do we have in bank accounts? Well, first step. How much could we borrow more from banks? Residual borrowing capacity. And third, do we have any apartments we can rapidly sell and get the money from taking over Ferrero? Because these apartments can be sold, presumably, without substantially modifying the competitive activity, the competing ability of Barilla. Okay, this is a first example of surplus asset. You want another one that could enrich your romantic dinner we were introducing yesterday, the date? There's another company that produces glasses. number one in the world Italian company. Ma siete guardate che comari che siete, sempre dico i nomi. E saresti la Luxottica? Sì, esatto. When I used to read this goes even more far in the past, when I used to read the annual reports of Luxottica, we're talking of the 90s, 95, 96, I remember that Luxottica was already big, was already a leader, the world leader of producing glasses. You know the story of Luxottica, you know it, right? The founder, which was an orphan, Mr. Del Vecchio. He was an orphan from the Martinique, which is an orphanage in Milan. He started as a worker, and he has become one of the more richest men on the planet. Surely in Italy, but even in the planet. I admire this person. It's incredible. By the way, I discovered reading Luxottica statements some years ago that they are, first of all, they are located in Belluno, near Belluno actually, which is in the middle of nowhere, basically. And Belluno means in the Dolomiti Mountains, somewhere, okay, in Pieve di Cadore. And it was written in financial statements, in the notes to the financial statements of Luxottica. At that time it was only Luxottica, that the company owned at that time 3 private jets, the airplanes, okay, that were needed for moving Mr. Del Vecchio and his family and his managers, whatever, from the middle of nowhere where they were and they are, to Milan, to Rome, to Paris, to Frankfurt, to London, wherever needed for the daily activity that are there. But these guys, since they are very brilliant, when they didn't use for themselves the airplanes, they rent them out. Rather than staying in Treviso, I think, or Verona, I don't remember, there waiting for, so you know, if you need it, just you can rent it, okay? Now, these assets, especially if you have 3 private jets, probably one or 2 of them are redundant, right? Redundant. Surplus assets, okay? That you can presumably easily sell or get rid of in case of need, okay? This is another example of a surplus asset. Come li chiami tu?
Issam.
Prego?
Issam.
Che bel nome, da dove arrivi?
Origini marocchine.
No. Origini in che senso? Veniva, è bellissimo sta cosa. Io, vabbè, non voglio dire i fatti miei. Ho Riyadh a Marrakesh.
Ah sì?
Sì, sì.
Ma io vengo da un'altra città, Tinitra.
Ma tu parli italiano perfettamente, no?
Sì.
E sei nato qua?
Quando avevo 2 anni.
Andiamo non fa perdere tempo. No, Marocco, ragazzi, è un paese straordinario. You should go to Morocco as soon as it is possible to go there. It's 2 years I'm missing in Morocco. Ma chissà se sta ancora l'aereo. Boh, lo troverò in vaso. E lì poi Marrakesh, Rabat, stupendo, Fez, stupendo, bellissimo, città bellissimo, bellissimo. Ma poi il Marocco è molto laico se possono rispetto agli altri paesi.
Sì.
Che bella quest'aula. Bellissima, ti diverto troppo. Beh. But by the way, guys, what time is it? I know that it's not because I want to leave, but it's because I need to know where we are. Surplus assets, I told you. Maria, I told you about surplus assets. Now I need to tell you the most important component. Well, the most important. In a lot of cases, in a lot of circumstances, the most important component of these internal funds, financial flexibility, which is the surplus cash. This is an area, pay attention, because this is an area in which you can also advise companies when you start working, because this is an area in which it is required some assistance. What do we mean with surplus asset? Surplus cash or excess cash. Let me write again. Ci ho preso gusto ormai. Allora, no, sbagliato. Interrompo. Ok. Switching. Cambi telecamera. Interrompi un attimo, sì, interrompi, ma poi fai finta che torni indietro, va bene, ok. Pazzesco, pazzesco. Cosa vi volevo dire? Mi sono dimenticato.
Surplus cash.
Surplus surplus cash. What do we mean with surplus cash? Ideally, the cash. Shall I write with this color or with the pen? You prefer the pen? The cash and cash equivalents, cash and cash equivalents that a company has. This is a line that is in the financial statements of a firm. You have to trust me. It's called cash and cash equivalents. If you are attending Professor Busso, she surely has told you. Cash and cash equivalents. There is also another line which is called marketable securities. Okay, that could be. Let's write it. Marketable securities. Well, no, forget it, because otherwise things get. We could think about cash and cash equivalents. What from a financial standpoint you should be aware of is that cash and cash equivalent, this amount of money, which is expressed in euros, can be divided into two groups. The operational cash and the excess, or how do we call it, surplus cash, excess or surplus cash. Surplus cash. So that the operational cash plus non-operational cash or excess cash or surplus cash will give you the total cash and cash equivalents. Okay? Operational cash is the cash needed for running the firm. Cash needed for running the firm. So for paying the payrolls, utilities, suppliers of raw material, and so on and so forth. The excess cash is the cash held for what? For facing adversities, unexpected adversities. Or exploiting opportunities, right? Now, I'm saying something probably extremely obvious, so forgive me for that. But needless to say, when we want to compute the component of cash that belongs to the financial flexibility of a firm, we are de facto thinking only of this component. Because the first one is needed for daily purposes, we cannot count it. Okay, so it's only this part which is important for us. Now the problem is, what is the problem? Repeat me your name? Isami. The problem is, which percentage is non-operational? I mean, how can we split these into two components? Well, how do we know which part is operational and which part is non-operational?
Depending on the operation of the company.
Sorry?
Depending on the operation of the company.
In che senso? Ci ho fatto quei bei complimenti. Sì, absolutely. Makes absolutely. Or these, I'm trying to interpret these sophisticated. What he surely wanted to say is that it depends also on the amount of money needed for daily purposes. Okay. Is that correct? Correct. It makes sense. Okay. But still, we have a problem. Okay. And the problem is, at the end of the day, we need to set the discriminant. We need to divide it into things. Okay. What are the possible alternatives for doing it? I know that I'm presenting something that is not. Alternative number one, they don't see it, so, well, first let me describe it, then I will show the slide. I'll tell you number one, it's a little bit empirical, but I find it a good way for separating the operational from non-operational cash. The idea is the following. You select a group of comparable firms. Okay? You compute the ratio cash and cash equivalents. For example, this is an example. E.g., cash divided by total assets. You compute this ratio for the comparables or the industry as a whole, or the industry. Okay? And you get a certain percentage by definition. Then you compute the same ratio for your company. Comparables and also for your company. You get a percentage for your company as well. And if the difference between these two percentages could be interpreted with a pinch of salt as an estimate of the excess cash. In other words, suppose that you compare these percentage for the comparables, okay? And you have obtained, I don't know, 3%. 3%. These are the similar companies. Then you apply the same ratio to your company and you end up having 5%. Then you can reasonably say that this difference, 2%, is an excess cash that the company has. Why do you conclude that this could be a reasonable estimate of an excess cash? Because the idea is very simple. The assumption is very simple. What you are assuming is that, on average, it seems that this business in which the company operates needs 3% cash for going ahead. Standard. 3%. My company, the one I'm interested in, has 5%. So presumably 3%, like the others, is needed for daily businesses, and 2% is an excess cash. This is a very simple solution, but I believe rather reasonable. Then it's always better than an answer like say, it depends, we'll see. No? Other rules were provided by, for example, the same interview I was mentioning before of the CFO of Microsoft. It was a pure financial interview. The lady also asked him, how much money do you think it is needed for running your daily business, right? And he answered, I remember that 3 months of expenses. So they believe that they need to keep at least, to keep aside the money for covering the expenses for 3 months in order to feel safe. That's the operational cash. Ideally, I presume the rest is excess cash. In that case, it was the excess cash. Operational cash was this, excess cash was this, but that's an exception. I mean, you don't see a lot of companies like Microsoft out there, right? It's an exception. Normally, the excess cash, if any, if it does exist, it's a relative minor percentage, okay? Can you follow me? Okay. And let me go back to the slides now. And here you have an example of this percentage that I was mentioning before, a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, no, more than 5 years ago, 4 years ago. an example applied to Accor. Accor is a French company operating in the hotel business. Okay, it's a very big company. It was big in 2017. It's much bigger today. In any case, it owns Sofitel. It owns a lot of other Formula N. No, Formula N. It's not. I don't remember if it is owned by Accor or not. But in any case, it's a huge hotel chain. And I wanted to compute, as an example, needless to say, the excess cash of Accor, presumably the excess cash of Accor. I selected some comparable firms: Intercontinental, Hyatt, Shangri-La, Melia, Millennium, White Bread, China Lodging Group, Windham, and so on and so forth. And I downloaded the data, okay, concerning what? Concerning the percentage. The percentage means the cash over total assets. Okay, for 5 years. And these are the results that I got. And I compute the average for each year. Okay. 7.84 means the average of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 numbers. 10.81 means the average of this plus 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 this. Yeah, the comparables. And so, according to these percentages, the amount of cash that Accor could consider as operational were these amounts: 945 million euros, 1.2 billion, 1 billion, 900 million, 600 million, so on and so forth. What was the actual level of cash that Accor had in those specific years? You see, reported in this one: 1 billion, 1.2 billion, 2 billion, and so on and so forth. This difference between the actual level of cash, for example, in 2015, 2.9 billion, the actual level of cash held by Accor, and the level of cash that would correspond at 11.3% of the comparable firms, this difference was an estimate of the excess cash that the company had at that time. Assuming that you operate in the same business, it seems that on average 10 to 11% cash is enough for running your company. If you have more, that more could be qualified as an excess cash. That was basically the idea. Okay, so we have finally also ended with the pecking order model. Now you know two possible explanatory models of the behavior of firms in terms of how do we finance ourselves. I mean, you remember the question that we are addressing, that I stated at the beginning of our meeting yesterday, was where should we position the line between debt and equity? You remember? In other words, how should we finance our firm? What is the mix between debt and equity that we should have? And we have so far, in 2 afternoons, we have examined 2 possible models that help us explaining the actual behavior of firms. The first to this regard, the first model has been the trade-off model that says that where to put the line between debt and equity is the result of a comparison between the pros and the cons of debt financing, and that was the trade-off model. Conversely, the second model, which is the pecking order model, says that basically the choices of firms concerning their capital structure are driven by how much they can self-finance their investments using internal resources. And depending on the relative amount of cash, or financial flexibility that they have, we do expect a higher or a lower amount of external financing. First, in case that it goes for external financing, debt financing, And secondly, if he decides to go for external financing and debt is not adequate, equity financing. Okay? And that's it. The other, I would suggest that the other, well, no, actually, let's take a look. So, what do we observe in practice? Okay, now that we have the two models, the two competing models, because they compete one against the other, although the first one is more popular in practice. What kind of evidence do we observe in practice, and how can they be interpreted using the two models that we have? Okay. There is quite consensus, not overwhelming consensus, but a high percentage of observers that will state that what we observe in practice is that large firms tend to have higher debt ratio. So bigger firms tend to borrow more. First element that we observe in practice. Smaller firms borrow less. Second, another important piece of evidence that we have is that firms that have a higher percentage of fixed tangible assets, they tend to have also higher debt ratios. In other words, they tend to borrow more. Okay? Second important evidence. Third evidence, firms that have a high market to book ratio, they tend to have lower debt ratios. What do we mean with market to book ratios? We mean a ratio between market value of equity and book value of equity. Market value of equity and book value of equity. It's a multiple. It is called a multiple. It belongs to the magical world of stock market multiples. Now, without entering that much into details, please note that the higher this ratio, market to book value, the higher the goodwill of a firm. The higher the goodwill of a firm. And what we observe is that firms with higher market to book ratio tend to have lower debt ratio. Finally, as I told you before, I believe, more profitable firms tend to have lower debt ratios. This is something we recommended before, so it's just a recap. From these four pieces of evidence that we have, what can we draw as conclusions? Who is right, who is wrong? The trade-off model or the pecking order model? By observing the actual behavior of firms. Who is right, who is wrong? The trade-off supporters, they know that large companies, this one, size, the first element, with tangible assets, second element, they are less exposed to cost of financial distress and would expect to borrow more. Let me read and then I comment. Moreover, they interpret the market to book ratio, which means the third one, as a measure of growth opportunities and argue that growth companies could face high costs of financial distress. That's the supporters of the pecking order theory. They say the first three elements that you mentioned, Antonio, are perfectly consistent with our model. On the other side, the pecking order theory advocates, they stress the importance of the fourth element, the element of profitability, arguing that profitable firms use less debt because they can rely more intensively on internal financing. So what I want to tell you is that we have mixed evidence supporting both models. Okay, the first three elements actually do support the prescriptions of the trade-off model, because bigger firms and or companies which are full of tangible fixed assets, as the explanation here says, they are less exposed to financial distress costs. Why? Because they can provide assets as collateral, and thus they can borrow more. Okay. At the same time, the trade-off model would say that since companies which are full of growth options rather than actual growth, expected growth options, they tend to have higher financial distress costs. We would expect this company to borrow less. And that's exactly what we're observing right now. However, there is one piece of evidence that the trade-off model cannot explain, the fourth one. Because the trade-off model cannot provide any insight about what we do expect with the profitability of firms. And at the same time, the pecking order model can perfectly deal with the fourth piece of evidence, because as we have learned, profitability and high profitability is a synonym of, if I may say, it's a synonym of higher ability of the firm to generate internal funds for financing new investments, and thus we would expect, that's why we would expect higher profitable firms to borrow less than the others. Okay? Okay. In any case, let's go back to the beginning. I know what you're thinking. I know. Antonio, this is disturbing. Disturbing means this is a little bit disappointing, more than disturbing. Why? Because we are young people, promising ones, we want to do our best in our job, but we need to have certainties. We don't need to have uncertainties, probabilities, who knows what happens from you. Because these two models could both be applied and have at least a portion of reality being described by each of them. So this is a little bit frustrating. And I agree with you, it's frustrating, absolutely frustrating. However, there's the intermediate bullet point here that says a good word about this conundrum. Relax. Don't waste time searching for a magical formula, I believe, for the optimum temperature. Remember, and that's the lesson that we have learned from Modigliani and Miller, we're back to the basics. Remember that at the end of the day, real value generation ability of a firm comes from the left side of the balance sheet, not the right side. Okay? Or it comes only mildly, only marginally from the right side. Because even if we go back to the trade-off model for 1 second, remember the tax advantage of that. Okay, it's okay. But we have alternative tax shields. We do not necessarily borrow money just for reducing the tax bill. Having the banks in our company and being absolutely, invasive. Why should we borrow money just to reduce the tax bill? We can use alternative tax shields. We can invent fictitious costs. We can accelerate depreciation. We can do a lot of things rather than simply borrowing for reducing. Because by borrowing money, you pay an interest rate and you have an invasive presence of banks in your company. And this is something that at the end of the day you may be willing to avoid. You see what I mean? The evidence that I was showing before, financial distress cost is important, okay. Tax advantage is important, okay. But it's never as important, these factors, they are never as important as how good you are in your daily business. Whenever there is a company that starts or tries replacing its ability on the asset side of generating operational profits with a magical combination of sources of financing or whatever they may invent for distracting your attention from the asset side, there's a problem. I believe there's a problem somewhere. So you should be cautious and suspicious when you're dealing with these things. In any case, I believe that probably the most interesting and the most reasonable thing that you could say is that the mix of debt and equity within a firm changes according to the stage of the life cycle that the company is going through. And this is one of the few certainties that I have. Here there's a description of 3, 4, 5, even 5 is even too much probably, But you would do startup, expansion, maturity, decline, so something like the expansion and growth. It's probably too detailed, this thing. But if you think about it, the more you move from the startup phase to maturity of a firm, the more the company becomes known. It has invested, it accumulates investments, it starts generating profits and cash, and so it can face a higher level of debt. Okay? And in fact, you see that the more you move from the left to the right, minimal debt, increasing that ratio, high debt ratio. The more you move from the left to the right through the life cycle of the company, the more you would expect the company being able to afford a higher level of debt. Okay, and this is something that you observe in practice. Have you ever seen a startup strongly financed with debt, bank debt? No. Why? Because that company is a startup. It means that it doesn't have any track record. That company is a startup. It means that the credibility of managers and the credibility of the idea is still to be tested. That company is a startup, and presumably it doesn't have enough fixed assets that can be provided as a collateral. That company is a startup, and thus presumably it doesn't generate profits because it's in its startup phase that could be used for servicing the debt payment. These are 5 reasons, I believe, that could help us understanding why startup firms they don't use that at all. Okay, they cannot use them. But then, from the startup phase toward the maturity phase, things progressively change. And progressively change, referring to the 5 factors I was mentioning before, means that the company starts being known, the managers starts being tested, their credibility, their reputation, their ethical attitude, and so on and so forth. The company grows and accumulates investments that can be provided as collateral. The company grows and starts becoming also profitable, hopefully. And if that's the case, if you consider all these things together, it means that the company overall increases its debt capacity. And if you have a higher debt capacity, you borrow more. It's a fact. You borrow more. Okay? So the trade-off model, I believe that still applies, and probably it explains the vast majority of behaviors of the firm. I remember, I forgot a 5th element. The tax advantage of debt for a company that is in a startup phase is nil, it's negligible. Who cares? You don't earn money, you don't need to reduce the tax bill. Actually, you have a tax credit. Why the hell should you borrow money just for reducing a tax bill that is already zero? You see, these are very practical things. And this is good news for me because it helps me, I hope, justifying the fact that I believe that these things are everything but theoretical. Because companies do apply them in practice, formally or informally, every day. A final point, and then we will leave the room, okay? A final point is comes from the industry. What do I mean with that? I mean that you may argue, I deliberately position myself here so that you hear me well. You may argue what follows. Actor. Yes? But, you know what? At the end of the day, if I am a soft drink producer, or, I don't know, a chain of restaurants, or an energy producer, whatever I am, or whatever business I'm in, I believe that in a lot of cases, the entrepreneurs, the owners of these businesses, rather than flying high with this trade-off model, pecking order model is not flying, you're staying with your feet on the ground, frankly. But so these models, which are very theoretical, probably the easiest thing that they could do, these entrepreneurs and shareholders, is to benchmark on the other companies that operate in your business. It means that if I am an hotelier, like Accor, one thing I would be tempted to do is to look at the other hotel chains, what they do, and imitate. Why? Because I assume, and I believe it's not a strong assumption, that the average behavior of the others is a rational one. And if it is rational their behavior, I could imitate what they do. Or at least, let's put it the other way around. If I differentiate myself in terms of my capital structure decisions from the average behavior of the business, I need to have strong reasons for doing that. Can you imagine, and these are some examples which are provided in your set of slides. Can you imagine, for example, an airline company that is financed with short-term financing? Doesn't make any sense, right? Why? Because the major asset that an airline company owns or leases is the airplanes. The airplane is a long-term investment for an airline company. Would you feel at ease by assuming that a long-term investment should be financed with short-term financing? Doesn't make any sense. Would you purchase an apartment with a bank overdraft or with a loan? The other one, Francesca.
With a loan.
With a loan, right. Or bank overdraft or scoperto bancario for financing the purchase of an apartment. Why? Let me speak like a textbook. Because for you, for us, the acquisition, the purchase of an apartment is a long-term investment, and you finance it. You're thinking of financing it with a short-term debt like a bank overdraft. It doesn't make any sense. There's a mismatch between cash inflows and cash outflows. While conversely, you tend to believe that a long-term investment, the purchase of an apartment, should be financed with a long-term financing, a loan. You're matching the assets with the liabilities. Something similar applies not only to individuals but also to companies. And if an airline company has as a major investment airplanes, very long-term investments, you don't expect airline companies to be financed with short-term financing. Is that exactly what happens in practice, Antonio? Absolutely, because the average financing of well-managed airline companies is a long-term debt. It's long-term debt. So you don't need to be a wizard. Let me go back to the benchmarking. If you are Mr. Ryanair, one thing that you're tempted to do is, let's take a look at what the other companies do for financing themselves. Because presumably they will finance, you will discover that they will finance the investments in airplanes with long-term financing. Or the other way around. I think the other example is on computer manufacturers. Yes, computer manufacturers. Do you expect the computer manufacturers to be highly leveraged? No. Why? I would expect them to be mainly equity financed. Why? Because computers, they become obsolete rapidly. The average life of a computer is between 2 and 3 years. 2 and 3 years is nothing for a company. So in that case, either you borrow money short term, you don't borrow money long term, the matching between the average duration of assets and the average duration of liabilities, of which we will spend additional time tomorrow, by the way. It's a very important principle. Or you finance the computers with equity financing. Because the equity financing is indefinite maturity, okay? And you are not pressured by the need of launching new products every 2.5 years. 2.5 years on the market in order to remain competitive. So by benchmarking on other companies that belong to the same business to which you belong is another final possibility that companies frequently choose, adopt, use in order to set the appropriate financial decisions. Questions? You want to go home? I understand that. So, thank you very much for your attention, my dear friends. I hope to see you back tomorrow at noon we're gonna go with the second set of slides, and then well, actually, we could do the other way around. We could do